So hi, I'm Mary Purcell. I'm the chair of the Foglietta Plaza Committee of the Society Hill Civic Association. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending. Some of you are aware that redesigns of Foglietta Plaza have been tried before and may be wondering, so what's different now? Well, when we started out about a year and a half ago under the leadership of our president then of the Civic Association, President Larry Spector, we started with a fresh slate. We tapped all of the varied stakeholders, whom I call both a challenge and an asset. And it's hard to gain consensus across such a varied group of stakeholders. And if you can do it, I think that's the secret sauce. And pretty much we did that. We found there was more consensus than difference. Where there were differences, there was willingness to bend. So many of you have seen the programming and use study that came out of that process a year ago. Thanks to the able and creative facilitation of OLIN and the constructive participation of the stakeholders. And Michael Miller will show you the long list of folks that were involved in that process and are involved in this now in the design study. So the programming study showed a desire for more greenscape, less hardscape, respect for the existing trees and memorials, central lawn and gardens. And the design you'll see today answers the call of that programming study beautifully. Before I hand the meeting over to Michael Miller of OLIN, there are some people I need to thank. To the Society Hill Civic Association, who took a leap of faith and funded and supported the use study, and then offered some money to progress to this design project. I need to thank the lead donors for this design phase, and that's Elcor of 1 Dock Street, Penn's Landing Square, Society Hill Towers, Delaware River Waterfront Corporation, and to the literally dozens of grassroots donations from folks across the community. The support for the project has been deep and wide, and we really appreciate it. I need to call out for particular thanks, Councilmember Squilla. He secured a city grant for us that topped off our fundraising. And I want to thank Chris Creelman of Parks and Rec, who navigated us through the city bureaucracy in order for us to receive the grant. I also want to note the city and state and agency participants who I have found to be quite committed, engaged, and really impressive. And Mary Isaacson's office, our representative, our state rep, has also been very helpful and engaged. I want to thank my fellow committee members, Lorna Katz-Lawson, Bob Kramer, Bill Yanch, Molly McIntyre, and Larry Spector, all of whom have contributed tirelessly, each in their own ways, and have provided critical insight and support. And finally, thank you to OLIN for their commitment and their beautiful work and their investment really in Foglietta Plaza, led by Michael Miller and Cindy Sanders and their team, including Lucy Whitaker. And with that, I turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Mary. That was a great introduction, and it makes my work much easier because we do have a lot to go through tonight. But as Mary said, we're really building on a lot of work that has gone before through the programming and use study, really building consensus around the vision for this place, what it can be to so many different people. And what we're talking about today is really the physical embodiment of that work into design. So what we'd like to do this evening, first just recap the purpose of this project, what it's about, review the findings from that 2021 programming and use study that Mary mentioned, summarize the concept design process that we've been following and building on that, present the preferred concept design that has emerged from that process, and then we'll open it up for comments, questions at the end. So here's what we're doing. We are working to develop a conceptual design for Foglietta Plaza that respects the uses and needs identified with broad public and stakeholder support in the 2021 programming and use study. So again, we're building on this work that has gone before and the deep engagement that it involved. So this is where we've been in a little bit more detail. Our work began back in September of 2021 with stakeholder engagement. And as Mary mentioned, there's a long list, which I'll show in a moment. And then we followed that up with a pair of open public meetings. First, an on-site walking tour and discussion of use with folks from the neighborhood. And then a second online public meeting like this, but much more of a listening session where we really tried to understand how people wanted to use Foglietta Plaza, what it could mean to them. Building on that, we captured the findings and the broad consensus that Mary mentioned in a final report, and also presented it at a third public meeting in February of 2022. Since then, we've moved into concept design, so starting in December of 2022 and January of this year, and further stakeholder engagement. So going back to that same group, working with them through alternatives to arrive at the draft concept design that we are presenting this evening. From here, where we'll be going is finalizing the concept design, taking into account comments that we hear tonight, developing a preliminary cost estimate so we can begin to put at least a rough price tag on what these improvements would cost. Taking a look again at the structure, we'll talk about this, but part of the plaza is on a bridge over I-95. So just doing a feasibility check, making sure what we're proposing will work there. And then a final report capturing this concept design process. But of course, that wouldn't be the end of the road. To get to construction, there's further design documentation, permitting work that needs to be done. And so from there, Society Hill Civic would be really looking for another lead organization to take this on. And we'll talk about this a little bit more at the end. There also needs to be funding for the future phases of work. And so this is important. Mary mentioned the donors that have chipped in so far and really allowed this vision to take shape. But part of the purpose of putting forth this vision is being able to attract further funding to carry it to the next step. So when we speak of Foglietta Plaza here, we're talking about the full area that you see highlighted in orange. So from Columbus Boulevard on the east to 38th Parallel Place on the west, Spruce Street on the south to Dock Street on the north, including the pedestrianized alignment of Front Street as it moves through the plaza. So that's what we're working on when we're working on this concept design. We are not addressing in the design the Vietnam Veterans Memorial to the south, but it is an important neighbor, an important stakeholder in the process. And the design really needs to speak to that as well as the existing memorials within Foglietta Plaza. This is the plaza today. Many of you are probably familiar with it. This is in the eastern part over the highway cap, the open paved area flanked by trees, and it is often quite empty as you see it in this image, and that's part of what we're trying to address. These are some more images of Front Street, of the corners, some of the difficulties that, again, you probably all know if you're familiar with the plaza, with sight lines, visibility, safety, and so forth. So going back for a moment to the 2021 programming and use study, we wanted to walk you back through that process. This will be review for some people who've been to the earlier meetings and may be new to others that missed out on those. So we mentioned stakeholders, and it is a long list. It starts with Society Hill Civic Association as representative of the Society Hill neighborhood. We also engaged with a lot of the nearby neighbors that face directly on the plaza, Society Hill Towers, Pans Landing Square, and Elcor, the development of the One Dock Street Tower. I mentioned the memorials before, both those adjacent to and within the plaza. The folks associated with those groups have been very important in the process, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, Korean War Memorial, and there's a new one here listed, and we'll talk about this in a moment. There is a group interested in potentially locating a Pennsylvania, Iraq, and Afghanistan War Memorial within the plaza. We also engaged with the business improvement districts bordering the neighborhood, Old City, South Street, Head House Square. So those are all civic stakeholders on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, there are a number of agency stakeholders. So at the state level, PennDOT, Representative Mary Isaacson, At the city level, Councilmember Mark Squilla, the Philadelphia Department of Parks and Recreation, the Office of Arts, Culture, and the Creative Economy, the Office of Transportation, Infrastructure, and Sustainability, and then 2 nonprofits whose work very much impacts and intersects with the plaza, the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation and the Interstate Land Management Corporation, or ILMAC, that maintains much of the plaza today. So through the stakeholder engagement and through the open public meetings that we hosted during the earlier study, we really arrived at a consensus idea, not just of the programming, but of the character of the space, of what people wanted it to see. We heard that it should be attractive more so than it is today, that it should still be calm, but it should be active, that it should be much greener than what you see now, that it should integrate both neighborhood park elements and memorials, and that in the larger city, it should effectively connect Society Hill to the Delaware riverfront. So as we start to think about program, there's a question, because there is a park there today. We're not starting from scratch. So what stays, what needs repair, and what goes? There are some elements for all the Plaza's Fall that we think can and should remain. There are a number of mature trees, many of them in good health, that lend welcome green and shade. And we heard that those should be kept and built upon and enhanced. The existing memorials, of course, are crucial. There are 2 within the footprint of the plaza, the Korean War Memorial, which you see there on the left, and the Beirut Memorial on the right. What needs repair? So even if it were to remain in place, the paving, some of the walls, all exhibit deterioration that need to be addressed. Similarly, there are health, safety, and accessibility concerns. Some have to do with it just being older, parts of it being in disrepair, but also standards have changed over the years. And so in order to meet current standards of accessibility and best practice, we would be looking at making the plaza much more universally accessible. And then the fun part, the transformative part, what's new? So Mary gave a little preview of this. We heard that a great central lawn would really do a lot to create a green common gathering space at the heart of the plaza. A simple intervention, but a powerful one. That lawn might be flanked with gardens that would provide a place of calm and respite that would have variation in color and texture and seasonal interest. Better places to sit. It's not a very inviting place to stop and pause and sit today. So fixed seating like benches, more casual, movable seating, and making better use of the walls and steps that are required to negotiate grade changes within the plaza. So thinking about integrating seating. Better lighting, so it doesn't just feel safe at night, but it feels welcome, feels beautiful, feels inviting. Signage and wayfinding, both to allow people to find their way through the plaza to larger destinations like the riverfront, but also to find attractions within the plaza, especially we heard with the memorials that people don't necessarily understand that they're there or how they connect. Something to attenuate the sound. So we're right next to I-95. So whether it's a sound wall or a landscape device to buffer that sound, creating a place that is a bit quieter and more peaceful. I mentioned accessibility improvements, but when we think about that, we're not just looking at regulatory compliance, we're thinking about how to take accessibility and movement as a chance to create a journey, create a beautiful progression through the space. Events and activities, we heard loud and clear that they shouldn't be large and loud nighttime performances, but daytime uses like markets, exercise classes, small time performances, things that would add some life, some attraction, some character to the place. So all of those things that I've just gone through, as Mary said, there was an incredibly strong consensus on them across a really diverse range of stakeholder groups. But of course, you can't expect everybody to agree on everything. So there were some points that were contested. And I'll go through those, what the conversation was, and then ultimately the recommendations that we put forward in the final programming and use study. So one was dogs and dog parks. I think everybody agreed that it is a neighborhood park. People will walk their dogs there. But there were some people that said, hey, we don't have an off-leash dog park in the neighborhood. We could really use one. Could this be the spot? On the flip side, we heard from some of the nearby neighbors concerns about noise, concerns about nuisance. And we also heard from the memorial groups that, it didn't necessarily fit with the character and the level of respect that they were hoping for within the park. Cafes and food trucks. We heard some people interested in there being food and beverage available in the park as an amenity. On the other hand, we heard some concerns about noise, about smell, about garbage, and also about the market viability of food and beverage in this location. Community gardens, again, we heard that this is something that is currently lacking in the neighborhood. But then we heard concerns about the potential messiness, and maybe more importantly, about the way that community gardens can sometimes create a semi-privatized space within a larger public space. Additional memorials was a big one. So I already mentioned that there is a group interested in locating a new Iraq and Afghanistan memorial within the plaza. We spoke with this group and, they mentioned co-location with other memorials. They mentioned that people already go there for the Veterans Day, Memorial Day remembrances, and they've established strong connections between groups and families affected by the different wars. So a really strong and compelling reason for why they would want to locate here. On the other hand, we heard concerns at the neighborhood level about the design and character of a potential memorial, about the scale of it, and just generally whether memorials would come to dominate the space rather than it being a balance of memorials and neighborhood park elements. Similar concerns came up around public art. On the one hand, we heard an interest in it. These are actually images from an earlier proposal back in 2016 to locate a sculpture garden within the park. Ultimately, there was no consensus on that, but still, we heard in this process that, hey, public art could be something that adds some interest, some life. On the flip side, we heard concerns about that coming to dominate and coming to detract potentially from other uses. So there were pros and cons to all of these, all with a great deal of validity. So weighing all of this and really weighing it strongly, not just between the different opinions that we heard, but between that unifying statement of character that we put forth at the beginning of the session, these were the recommendations that we made at the end of the programming and use study. So we recommended that there not be a structured off-leash dog park within Foglietta Plaza. Again, it's a neighborhood park. We expect dogs to be there and to be welcome there. But we did agree that, particularly taking into account both the neighborhood concerns and the concerns of the memorial groups, that this might not be the best space in the neighborhood. When it came to food and beverage, we said that there were enough concerns that investing in a fixed cafe, which is a very big investment, might not make sense, especially because it might not be viable from a market perspective. On the other hand, we said if there's interest in food and beverage, maybe this is something that could be experimented with food trucks and that kind of thing. It could be on event days. It's easy to test that out, see if some of the concerns can be addressed, see if it's a success, and then build on that if there is strong consensus for it. We recommended against a community garden, again, understanding concerns both from nearby neighbors and the memorial groups, and really thinking about that issue of potential privatization of this very precious public space. Then when it came to the memorials and the public art, we said maybe, we said potentially in, we said the devil is in the details, because that's really what we heard from the stakeholders, that nobody was opposed to it from a blanket perspective, but they wanted to understand the design and they really wanted to be involved in the process to ensure that there was a good balance with other elements in the design and to ensure that there was broad buy-in. So we said really what is needed is ongoing engagement around these two elements and integration into the design. And you'll see that we've done quite a bit of thinking about that integration in the concept that we're going to present tonight. So that's an overview of the programming and use study. And again, that is really the foundation for the design process that we've gone through more recently. But there are other things that we need to be thinking about too, practical and technical concerns that informed the concept design. So we'll go through those very quickly and then get on to the presentation of the concept. So one is grade changes and topography. So from the south side of the park to the northwest corner, there's about a 10-foot grade change, which is quite a bit across this distance. So if you've noticed some of the steps and walls that interrupt the plaza, we can do a better job here, but we do need to address that grade change. Structural capacity. So we're looking here from the north. The east side of the plaza is on an existing bridge over I-95. And so as we design, we need to be mindful of the structural capacity of that existing structure there. There are also elements that relate to the highway within the park, like this building, which is quite prominent. It dominates the southwest corner and it is not beautiful. We understand from PennDOT that the western half of the building that you can see with the vents here is mechanical equipment that must remain in place. So we have to retain at least that portion, and we would be looking at improving the facade, improving its relationship to the park. The eastern portion are restrooms that are currently not used most of the time. There are operational and maintenance issues with those. So we do have the potential of removing those, which would lessen the presence of this building and open up more space for other elements. High walls and narrow paths. I mentioned this at the very beginning with some of those images. It's part of what makes the plaza not so successful today, part of what makes it not inviting from the street, and not always feeling very safe. The noise, again, we heard that people want this to be a calm, contemplative space, but it's over an interstate highway. So how do you address that? And then the other complication of its location over the highway is the timeline of I-95 construction. So many of you, if you've participated in some of the meetings around the Penn's Landing CAP project, you know that I-95 is being rebuilt bit by PennDOT. So the Penn's Landing CAP is the first piece south of Ben Franklin Bridge that will be done as part of this process. Foglietta Plaza is one of the last. In between, they have to rebuild the viaduct structure that goes from Queen Village to the airport. So we have about 20 to 25 years until the Foglietta Plaza bridge structure will be rebuilt. And that's kind of a difficult in-between time period because it's really too long to leave the plaza as it is today. On the other hand, it's shorter than what we'd expect the typical lifespan of a public space to be. So we started thinking about this as a sort of long temporary project, at least for the part of the park that's over the cap. So how do we invest at a level that's appropriate to that long temporary condition? And then finally, as I mentioned before, funding will need to be identified for this project. And most public spaces today are funded by a combination of public and private sources that are brought together in one project. So here we might look at state funding, both for multimodal transportation improvements and also some of those accessibility issues that I mentioned. There may be foundation or other philanthropic funding that could fund specific elements or a more general approach, for example, an experimental data-driven approach to managing the plaza. And then finally, big elements of program like the memorials art may attract some specific sources of funding, but they could preclude others. So again, these were things that we took into account as we were looking at the design. So that was a lot. How do you bring that all together? Well, we started the old-fashioned way by putting up different variables on the wall that we needed to work through, by sketching out options, by working quickly and iterating. And from that process, we landed on 3 initial alternatives, different ways of addressing the same elements of program and the same design challenges. So I won't go into great detail here on the 3. What I would actually really like to focus on is just how much commonality there was. And that speaks, I think, to the strength of the programming and use study, because we really knew what people wanted to see here. The question was, what was the best configuration. Was it working with the existing structure of the plaza, its walls and materials to reconfigure it? Was it imagining it as a different and more fluid topography, or was it drawing a strong contrast between what was happening temporarily over the cap and a more permanent investment of the western side of the plaza? We reviewed these 3 designs with that whole list of stakeholders that I showed earlier on. And based on their feedback, we identified the Green Plaza as the preferred alternative. And so we're going to go into a lot more detail on this design, but I'll just mention a few of the things that tip the scales in the favor of this concept. One was that almost universal desire for a large central lawn. And all of the options had it to some extent, but this one really emphasizes it and really puts it front and center. At the same time, we mentioned the flexibility of seating in the programming study. And in addition to benches and tables and chairs, the reuse of existing walls, which I'll talk about more, really gave a lot of different seating options. Similarly, that desire for gardens that you could sit in, walk through, a place of comfort and respite was emphasized in this alternative. And then the stakeholders felt that there was a great deal of clarity in the design of the western side of the plaza, and particularly the way it related to existing and proposed memorials. So I'll talk a little bit more about what we're calling the Green Plaza. Another thing we look at when we start design is thinking about precedents, places that we know that might have elements that we could draw on or elements that we're trying to achieve. So on the left side, you see Bryant Park in New York City, which many of you may know. This is a project our office worked on back in the 90s. And it really celebrates that simple, central, flexible space surrounded by a strong frame of trees and gardens. And also, interestingly enough, this too was a kind of renovation project, a reorganizing and clarifying of an existing design, much like what we're trying to do here at Foglietta Plaza. On the right-hand side, you see a more recent project that Cindy and I both worked on at the Akron Art Museum in Ohio. This too has a series of clear, legible spaces, but it really makes the most of the grade changes here because there was also a lot of topography that we needed to negotiate. And so you see the integration of the seating on the walls, and in the background, a meandering crisscross walk, which we showed an image of, that really makes the most of grade changes and turns it into an experience. So as I said, what we tried to do with this design was really take the existing plan and revise it, clarify it, clean it up, and also make it more green. And it was a challenge because you can see looking at this drawing just how maze-like it is. But we said, can we reuse some of the existing walls? Can we reuse some of the existing paving? Can we keep some of those nice mature trees? And so then this is the transformation that we then proposed. Really, again, keeping elements, but subtracting others, adding new ones in to clarify the plan. And really to define, a few key spaces. So first, that central lawn that I mentioned, which you see right up here, flanked by a series of gardens on the north side, including some topography to help screen the noise from the highway, but then the idea of a sensory garden on the south side that would really be a powerful and ever-changing experience. A pair of bosques or groves of trees that would provide a strong and dignified frame to the Korean War Memorial, but also provide shady seating underneath. And then finally, a looser, more casual neighborhood space that we call the Grove on the southwest side. Something that you can't see in those plan view drawings, but you can see here in these cross sections is another strategy that we're proposing to deal with some of the issues of the existing walls. Part of what is challenging about them is they're so tall, they're so imposing, they impede views. Over the highway, we do need some walls, or we do need some elevation in order to raise up trees and other plantings above the structure and provide for the soil that they need. But inside the park, we also have the possibility of raising up the adjacent grade, whether this is a paved walkway or that lawn, so that the walls are less imposing, and they're also at a comfortable height, 1.5 feet or 2 feet, for people to sit on and enjoy. Other elements within the plaza. So we've talked quite a bit about memorials. Of course, there's the existing Korean War Memorial here, and we're showing a new location for the existing Beirut Memorial here, really strongly related to both the Korean War Memorial and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Should, through public engagement, there be a consensus that there should be another memorial there, a substantial one like that Iraq and Afghanistan memorial that we mentioned, we identified this location in the southwest corner as the most likely for a few reasons. It too strongly relates to both of the existing memorials, but critically it is not located over the highway cap. And this means that in 20 to 25 years, when the eastern part needs to rebuild, this memorial could remain in place. We know from the Penn's Landing Cat Park project that the relocation of the Irish and Scottish memorials has been very logistically challenging and also very difficult for the communities that are related to those memorials. In addition, should there be the need to locate other smaller memorials or pieces of public art, the dots that we're showing in magenta are other potential locations for those. But you'll note that those are all small. We really heard the need to balance things like art and memorials with the neighborhood park elements. And so we think there really is only room for one larger one within this structure, and then potentially some other smaller features in order to maintain that balance. One thing we haven't really spoken about that much yet is bikes. So of course, Foglietta Plaza needs to be a strong pedestrian connection within the city, but we also know that there's quite a bit of bike traffic between the new Delaware River Trail to the east, the westbound protected Spruce Street bike lane to the west, and the northbound bike lane on Front Street from the south. And it's challenging here because Spruce Street today, as well as Dock Street and 38th Parallel Place, are built of the historic Belgian block, which is quite lovely, and it also serves to slow cars down a bit, but it's very uncomfortable and even dangerous for cyclists. So they tend to ride on the sidewalks, which can be a nuisance or a safety hazard for pedestrians. So what we're proposing here is to designate an area for off-street bike lanes that would be separated from sidewalks, but would enable cyclists to get through safely and not require any repaving of the streets. So you'll see we're proposing a westbound lane to the north and an eastbound lane just between Front Street and Columbus to the south. And this is outside of the formal study area, but after discussing with stakeholders and also with the city, this seemed like the best solution for the eastbound traffic. So it's a little easier to understand what's going on in a cross-sectional view here. This is Spruce Street. Then on either side, we have a 2-foot setback from the curb, a 5-foot, this is a one-way bike lane. And then there's 13 feet left over for the sidewalk, which is quite generous. We're also looking at relocating the existing bike share, which is currently on the north side of the plaza, to the south side, so it would be co-located with a bike lane. So those are a lot of the elements within the design, and we've talked a bit about the logic and strategy, but we wanted to close by giving a sense of what this would look and feel like on the ground to actually be within this space. So we're going to show you 3 perspective renderings. We've indicated the location on the plans here. So first, from the central lawn, looking across the sensory garden, second, within that garden, and then third, from the northwest corner, entering from Dock Street in the North Bosque. So this is a view from the lawn. It continues to the right-hand side of the frame here. Flanking that lawn is a brick walkway. So we think here that we would be able to reuse a lot of the existing brick material. And I should have mentioned this back in the selection of the Green Plaza alternative. Another reason that this alternative was favored is just how much maintaining and reuse of existing elements there can be, which has a cost benefit, but there's also a strong sustainability benefit. So if we think about the embodied carbon of demolition and of construction, the more we can reuse materials, the more we reduce that carbon footprint. So the brick you're seeing here would be salvaged, broken pieces would be discarded, and then the good ones reset into new paving. This brick wall here is partly existing, partly new, but again, we've raised the grade adjacent to it, so it's not so in your face, and it can be something that people can sit on, as well as these new benches. Beyond, you see the planting of the sensory garden and this nice clear view over to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. You can also in this view catch just a snippet of the Korean War Memorial to the right. And then beyond the existing building, which we're showing something new, a mural perhaps on it, as well as an indication here of where a new memorial might be located. Now we're within the sensory garden, moving through from a walkway into the main space. So here, the experience of the garden, experience of the planting, the seasonal change is really front and center. And we imagine it as a quiet contemplative space to sit, to meet up with friends and family, to stroll, and just really slow down and enjoy the surroundings, or perhaps to take a moment away from the emotional intensity of one of the memorials. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is off to the left. The Korean War Memorial is see beyond to the right. And then the sphere here is what we're indicating as a placeholder for a new memorial. So that is most certainly not a design. I want to be super clear on that, but just something to give a sense of where that might be located within the design. And then the last view is from the northwest bosque. So Dock Street is right behind you. You're sitting elevated up. You're underneath the canopy of shade trees. So if this were a hot summer day, this would be a nice place to get away from that intense sun, to sit for a bit, meet up with somebody, enjoy a drink, maybe do a little bit of work outdoors. Beyond that, you see, again, the Korean War Memorial a little closer here within a frame of planting. Rather than this edge being all steps, there is a central set of stairs, but also this accessible walkway that you see ramping down here. And then beyond, again, is that existing building. This is a placeholder for a memorial or some other graphic treatment that might be applied, but something really to kind of spruce it up, give it some life and character. And then also you can see just behind the idea of a pergola extending off of that, so another nice shady seating option. So that's the design, but as I said, the process isn't finished. Both the phase we're working on now, there's a little bit more work to do, and then yet more for this thing to be built. So within this concept design phase, we'll again be going back and doing final design revisions, doing that structural analysis to confirm that what we're showing there is fully feasible. We've been keeping in mind the prior analysis. We believe that it is, but we just need to double check. And then again, getting a preliminary cost estimate. And then looking beyond, we would need to determine the lead organizations for design and construction. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide, as well as seeking funding for next phases of work. So this is a graphic view of where we've been and where we might be going. So the Society Hill Civic Association has really organized and hosted both that critical programming and use study and the concept design work that you're seeing today. Beyond that, though, as we get into more technical design, as we start moving towards permitting and construction, the project really needs to be led by a public agency or a suitable nonprofit. So that's really the next stage here, is finding that champion for this project and for this process, building on the design vision, building on the strong consensus around use. Optimistically, this would take a minimum of 18 to 24 months if it proceeds straight through, because there are a lot of steps to get to construction and to get to a new plaza. Of course, we know that sometimes there are pauses, there are lags, there's a lot of organizational work to do. But again, knowing this time frame of I-95 reconstruction, we definitely feel that there is an urgency around this project and a need to deliver something that works much better than what is there today. So that concludes our formal presentation. And from here, I know people have probably been putting questions in the Q&A. If you have comments, if you just have questions as well, please feel free to submit them. And then Mary will be moderating a conversation. Thank you. Mary, you might be muted still.
Yes, okay, I fixed that. There is a question about the bathrooms. Currently, there are bathrooms in the building that you've been referencing. They are, as we understand it, they've been vandalized. They've not been upgraded in some time. I'm not sure what the condition of the bathrooms is at this time, but the consensus on the design was that we would not have those bathrooms would not be maintained or retained as part of the design. You know, what we've presented to the stakeholders was that they would be removed. There was some interest in bathrooms there, and I think the way we're looking at it is that the near neighbors are concerned that until we would know what the design would be, what the security would be, what the maintenance would be, they would be concerned about that use at the site. So if in the future we identify someone who wants to handle the construction and the maintenance and the security, I think that would be something we would engage the near neighbors in discussion. Michael, do you have anything else?
Yeah, just to build on that a little bit, you know, public restrooms can be an incredibly important amenity, but to be successful, they have to be maintained to the highest level. And one of the challenges of this process is, again, this project needs going forward an agency or nonprofit champion, not just for construction, but also for ongoing operations and maintenance. And so not knowing exactly what that organization will be, what that structure will be, we don't want to set the place up for failure. So potentially, if there is that level of investment, operations and maintenance, I think that could be part of the picture. And again, as Mary said, subject to ongoing engagement with the neighborhood. But we didn't want to place that front and center if there wasn't a plan for successful operations and maintenance.
All right, great. We had one question about the Beirut Memorial, if it would be moved, and I just responded that yes, the proposed design is that it should be removed. You spoke to that. We have a question about happy to see some of the public spaces used as inspiration. One of these elements, let's see, local commercial use, both permanent and seasonal. We did rule out, for example, the cafe. So he's asked, I guess, reaching back to the programming study, why did we not contemplate commercial use?
So first of all, I would say that on the practical side, there are a number of legal restrictions on what can happen, particularly over the I-95 cap. But at the same time, you know, I think there are two potential issues with commercial uses in public space. One is the potential privatization, and then the other is just the viability. Sometimes cafes are pitched as both an amenity and a way to generate revenue, but they can be challenging from a market perspective, and sometimes they actually have to be subsidized by the operating entity. And so again, not knowing the full picture of who would be managing, we felt that locking in a fixed commercial structure was problematic. And so what we said instead is, you know, there are other types of uses like that public spaces can hold. that are popular, that require less infrastructure, and that don't necessarily compete with neighborhood businesses. So, you know, we talked about markets. There's already a farmers market at Head House Square, but could there be a small art or craft market here? Similarly, on the food and beverage side, rather than one fixed cafe, maybe there could be food trucks on a regular schedule or for specific event days. So we do feel that that kind of thing has a place in the plaza, but maybe it takes a different form.
All right, thanks, Michael. We have a question about the Front Street walkway. Will it be ground level or have better ramps for wheelchairs and strollers?
Yes, yes, and I'm sorry I didn't emphasize this more in the presentation. One of the things that we said from the beginning is Front Street needs to be fully accessible. You know, this is a major and important connection within the city, and it's just a crime that you can't get through there with a stroller or a wheelchair today without taking a bunch of circuitous ramps. So in the design, the full width of it is sloped at an accessible grade from Spruce Street down to Dock Street.
Michael, about the parking on 38th parallel curbside.
So at the moment, we have proposed no changes to the parking or the traffic lanes of surrounding streets. So no change to where the curb line is or to what's happening between the curbs.
Someone here is concerned that the seating area in the Grove portion, that folks would loiter all day waiting for a bus. Not sure how when we create something, I think everyone becomes welcome. That.
Mary, you cut out just a little bit there, but I think what I heard was, you know, a concern about people loitering, about becoming too comfortable. You know, I think that is always a potential hazard when we create a comfortable and beautiful spot. But what we found in our work is that it really is more of an issue when it isn't as well designed, because then it only becomes a refuge for people who don't have choices. When a place is appealing to all of society and it attracts other kinds of positive use, one, people tend to be better behaved. They tend to keep it cleaner. They don't tend to dominate the space, and it really becomes much more balanced. So I think that the more people are using it, the more eyes on it, the less nuisance uses like that come to dominate a public space.
All right, we have a question here. Why not add the new memorial on the Vietnam Memorial Plaza? I don't know that there's any space for that there, for consideration of that.
Yes, that's certainly our understanding. And again, I would say that, you know, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial it's right next to, but it's outside of our study area. So that was not our charge to redesign that. But my understanding of that space is that in addition to the main space with the arced wall, there are a number of other memorial elements within that landscape. So there is quite a lot going on there now. And even between different war memorials, I think we want to create enough breathing room so that the different elements aren't crammed together.
All right, great. I have a message here from Thea Foglietta, thanking us for the work and wanting to make sure I've put this in the reporter article, and I learned this actually from Judge Angelo Foglietta. A lot of people think that Foglietta Plaza was named after our congressperson, Foglietta, who also became ambassador to Italy, but actually it was named for Michael Foglietta, who was Tom's father. He was, to my understanding, the first Italian-American elected to city council. He had a very large council district, all of Center City and South Philadelphia. He was involved in the enabling legislation to create the Independence National Historical Park. So Congressperson Foglietta, Tom Foglietta, had the the plaza named after, in fact, his father, Michael Foglietta. Yes, I've thank you for sharing that, Thea.
Thank you.
And thank you for attending. And let's ask resources.
Mary, I apologize. I think you cut out just a little bit there. I didn't catch all of that question.
Okay, it's the question is, will this space require additional police resources?
It's a good question. I wouldn't think so. We're not fundamentally changing the use of it as a public space. We're not suggesting very large events in it. And again, our expectation is that if we create a successful public space, there will be fewer nuisance uses of the plaza and more positive uses.
We have a few questions with regard to the dog park. I believe you've covered that in the presentation, Michael, that you know, the design that you've done is really responsive to the work that came out of the programming study. And you know, you discussed how the dog park was considered as a use and was not part of what was recommended coming out of the programming study. So yes, it would be good. You've noted, certainly we would support and will support dogs being in the park. We expect that people will walk their dogs and have their dogs in the park, but there was not a spot for a dog park in this particular park. Let's see, someone says the sensory garden seems too angular to be soothing. Perhaps an oval center garden and side gardens or curved edges. So somebody wants more curving.
So that's an interesting comment, and I think that you know, those questions of form, there are different perspectives on that. And I would also say that what we're showing here is an early concept, and the design can evolve as we move forward. And you may remember in some of those alternatives, we did explore more curving forms. One of the reasons that we worked with lines and angles in this particular concept was that desire to reuse existing elements, again, from a cost perspective, from a sustainability perspective, and especially, you know, thinking about the meaning of a garden in our contemporary world and city, really making sure that it's not just green on the surface, but that it's green under the hood was very important to us. So that was a constraint too. But I think that's an interesting comment. And something that we can think about as we move forward with the design.
All right, we have a question about loose chairs be stolen.
You know, that's an interesting one. First of all, I would say they can be, you know, wired together and loosely tethered so they don't move too much. But actually what we've found is that those things always walk away much less than you would expect. And again, part of it, I think, comes to setting the tone for civility with a nice design. And then part of it comes down to the operations and maintenance, which again is a little bit of an unknown here. But it's a type of seating that we've used in many other design firms. Many city agencies and nonprofits have used in a lot of different places. And generally there's very minimal loss. And if we use a relatively inexpensive product, then it's not a large cost to replace the few that might disappear.
All right, we have a question about estimating the annual maintenance costs.
Cindy, it looked like you were about to say something there, but I can keep going. I saw you start to jump on that one though.
Go ahead, Michael.
I would say it's a little bit early for that, in that we're just starting to estimate the capital costs for this, but it is an important question. And one thing that we have tried to do here is be a bit conservative in what we've put in and not put in too many elements that would require very high maintenance costs. For example, you don't see a fountain in the design for that very reason. I do want to acknowledge that the gardens will depend on maintenance. All planting requires maintenance. A beautiful garden requires some more. We think it would be worth it in this case, but that would be a cost. But as you know, if this project moves forward, and especially if it moves forward with a particular entity that is able to take this on, that kind of budgeting and analysis is something that they would do as part of their process. Cindy, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you've answered it extremely well. And it's also an opportunity for the neighborhood to develop a group to care for some of the plantings. So this will be an important conversation during the design phase.
Michael, there's a question about the lighting.
Yes. So at this early conceptual phase, we often state an intention for lighting, like, you know, this is an urban space. It needs to be safe and accessible at night, but at the same time, the light shouldn't be overbearing. But we have not yet engaged a lighting designer to design the specifics, and that's something that we'd be getting to in one of those next phases of design.
I think it's just to add on to that, dark sky is something that's vitally important to us. So we're not sending light up into the environment, and likewise not shining light in adjacent residences. So there will be great sensitivity toward lighting as we move forward.
And we have one recommendation that poop bag dispensers atop ski trash cans with a folded lid should be available in the park for the.
Yes, those are all good suggestions, and definitely keeping it clean and dealing with our dog friends as they are in the park is important.
Well, we've covered all of the questions. Oh, one more just came in. Let me see. There's a question here about Philadelphia history, the Marines that were founded just 2 blocks away. Folks come here for the history. Will the memorials reference or tie this element in?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it in part gets back to, we only touched on it briefly, the signage and wayfinding and also interpretation. So there are particular things that may be commemorated in the memorials themselves, but there also might be additional signage that draws connections between these and with local historical events. It's also possible that there could be a larger interpretive strategy that isn't just fixed in signage, because there's so many stories to tell, especially in a historic city like Philadelphia, and you also don't want to overwhelm. So it's possible that there could be a digital interpretive component as well. There are some great examples out there of ones that are actually place specific. So as you walk through with your phone, you can see different elements related to the spaces where you stand. So it's an area that needs more development, but I think that there are opportunities to tell a lot of different stories in a lot of different ways within the space.
Yeah, I might add that the real trick here is the coordination. Typically, the memorials are owned by, I say owned by, they're not literally owned by, but they are overseen by a special interest group. And so what has been challenging when thinking about the memorials is the integration of all of the different narratives. But this definitely is something that we have spoken about and been very interested in pursuing.
Michael, we've covered all of the questions. I'll wait just a moment to see if anybody else has another question to add. As I know, Michael, you'll be finalizing the design as you stated earlier and working on the confirming the load structure analysis and the preliminary construction cost estimate. And then we're looking for us to keep cheerleading and advocating and looking to find the our champion for the next steps after that to go into further design and construction.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for taking the time out of your evening to attend this, to listen, to add your thoughtful comments, and especially for people who have taken part in the earlier programming process, for the stakeholders who have volunteered their time. You are really what has made this happen, and we are deeply appreciative, and we're really pleased with the results and can't wait to see where it will go next.
Michael, we have one final comment. It says, thank you for all your work. Great compliment to the greater, this will be a great compliment to the greater Penn's Landing project. And it says, let's rock and roll.
Great. That's a good one to end on.
And yes, the recording will be made available.
Great. Great. All right. Well, thanks again.
All right. Thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Michael. Great job. Thank you, Cindy, Lucy, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.